To have a guest speaker to speak in our class, and the event is sponsored by the Nunn School and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies in the school. So I will first introduce the director of the center, Dr. Yang, and Dr. Yang will introduce our guest speaker today. So let's give Dr. Yang a round of applause.
Thank you, Dalton. I don't think I've ever been applauded for just turning up before. Thank you. Anyway, so I'm delighted to introduce someone I get to call a colleague, which is really cool. General Phil Breedlove. He's a distinguished professor in the Nunn School and a senior fellow at the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies. Before joining us, he's a highly decorated retired general of the United States Air Force, was the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. He was also the commander of U.S. European Command during 39 years of service following his graduation from Georgia Tech in civil engineering. He served in a variety of demanding command and staff positions, leading large-scale, diverse global operations across 2 theaters of combat and earning a reputation as an outstanding leader. So there's nobody I can think of would be better to talk to us about the changing geopolitical situation in Europe. So please join me in welcoming General Breedlove.
Okay, who was in my class earlier this morning? Okay, so you're going to hear a few things the same way. Grade my paper and see if I remain consistent. So actually, I'm glad to be here. You're going to the best university in this country. I'm not biased. I am a 1977 graduate. I studied engineering here, as you heard. I went on to study international affairs at the National War College and at MIT. And of course, I didn't use my civil engineering degree at all in the Air Force, and I used my international affairs business all the time. So all my experience is practical. I am not an academic. It's all practical. I am a student of history, and we've got some other incredible students of history here in the class as well. But today I'm going to talk about some practical matters. I was given 4 subjects to hit quickly, and I'm going to do those very quickly because what I really want to do is save the last almost half of the class for your questions, to open it up to you, to ask about anything you want to ask about contemporary or historical in NATO. I would just warn you right up front that I prided myself in my last 7 years of service as a 4-star general as being able to talk to both sides of the aisle, conservatives and liberals alike. And I did that by not taking political stances publicly on issues where I didn't think it would be helpful. I'm proud that since I graduated from the Air Force, I've been asked back to testify twice in Congress, once in the Senate, once in the Senate Select on Foreign Affairs, and once in the SAS, the Armed Services Committee. Once I was asked by a Democrat, once I was asked by a Republican. So why do I tell you this? If you ask me a politically charged question, I will probably defer, because I value my ability to be able to speak to both sides of the aisle, and so in a public forum I don't go political in my answers. It's not that I wouldn't want to engage you on your questions, it's just I will avoid those questions which are politically charged. So I was asked to talk a little bit to US, Europe, and Russia, a little bit to great power conflicts. I'm going to hit that lightly because I think you saw I'm going to actually give that talk more fully later on in my visit. I was asked to talk a little bit about Zapad, and then I was asked to talk a little bit about U.S. presence forward in Europe. So with those 4 light subjects, I'll just launch. For the folks who served with me, especially in senior leadership capacities, I think you would, if you asked them, they would all say that I am a hopeless optimist. Hopeless optimist. I find that the glass is over half full in almost every case. Rarely do I take a pessimistic view. I promise you that because I have a very pessimistic outlook right now about the way forward between the U.S., Europe, and Russia. I was a civil engineer. Those of you who have had any engineering courses know what a vector is: distance, force, or direction, and amount of force or travel. And you know that a vector will go unchanged unless an opposing force or vector is applied. Right now, we are on a bad vector with Russia. We are on a bad vector with Russia. A very trusted and learned colleague of mine and I have had meetings with them in the last 6 weeks. For me, it was 5.5 weeks ago with Michelle Flournoy and other very senior officials talking with senior Russian delegation. And then last week, another colleague of mine met with the Russians, and she used the words dark. Our relationship is dark and getting darker. I think that is indicative of my conversation with the Russians. Why do I think that our situation is dark? I blame this, frankly, on both of sides of the aisle in America. Right now, our nation is very, 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 I said it 3 times, I'll stop. I could say it more. We are very focused on what the Russians did or did not do in the election. And we are completely, I think, locked in on that conversation. So in my mother's words, some of you have heard this before, we are focused on a little row of azalea bushes on the leading edge of a sequoia forest. We are focused on a very small thing on the leading edge of a massive problem. And until we can get past that small thing in our nation, and again, I blame both sides of the aisle for this, we will not be able to get to the kind of conversations that I think we need to have with Russia. We need to affirmatively begin constructive conversations with Russia. In our relationship right now in Europe, Russia and some of our nations are applying all manner of new tools in order to try to affect our relationship. During the, you can't answer, during the Warsaw Pact days, what was the primary tool that our nation used to deal with Soviet Russia? Anybody has a guess? Spies are one element of it. Another thought? We use primarily a military tool to deal with Russia. We had a huge land force and air force and a surrounding naval force in Europe to deal with the possible incursion of the Warsaw Pact. So in this simple definition that I use of national power, DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. During the Warsaw Pact days, we were focused almost entirely on the military element of U.S. national power. During and to this day in Ukraine, as we deal with the invasion of Crimea and then the supported invasion of the Donbass, what has been our nation's primary tool in dealing with Russia at this point?
Economic sanctions.
Economics, almost wholly. Some minor military things, some minor diplomatic things, really zero efforts in the informational field, and most of our tools have been economic. But I would opine to you that in the struggle now, or the conversations now that we have between the West, US and Europe, and Russia, Russia is using every tool in the basket. Let's examine Ukraine. Diplomatically, daily attacks on the leadership in Kyiv to discredit the government that resulted from the Maidan. Daily attacks diplomatically in the information space, or as I like to call it, the disinformation space. Russia creating problem narratives that Western governments have to deal with. Let's take the shoot down of MI-17. Everyone remember that? Malaysians and Northern Europeans killed on the airplane shot down in eastern Ukraine. Within 2 hours and 13 minutes, I know exactly because we timed it, within 2 hours and 13 minutes, Russia had put 4 narratives on the street blaming the West for that shoot down. One of the narratives said that it was an American airplane filled with corpses crashed into the east to blame the Russians. But they had 4 different narratives on the street within 2 hours and 13 minutes. It took us 2 years to respond to those 4 narratives definitively. So the information space is very active. The military space, of course, you have seen what went on in Crimea. You see what continues to go on in eastern Ukraine. The line of contact is active. People are getting wounded and killed every day on the line of contact in Ukraine. And then economically, who could give me an example of a tool economically that Russia is using against the Ukraine? Say it out loud, you got it.
Oil sales?
Oil sales, maybe more so natural gas sales in Ukraine, but the idea is the Russians are using pricing and delivery of energy to bring pressure on the Ukraine. So, how have things changed? From a Warsaw Pact pre-wall time frame where we were dealing to almost entirely economically, or militarily, to today where we're primarily only responding in the economic. But our opponent is more broadly using all the tools of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic as they bring pressures to bear. If we have time, I would ask you to ask me a little bit about Montenegro, what just happened in Montenegro, and what's happening today in Spain. And let's see how this applies. The bottom line is our opponent has entered into a time where he feels unconstrained in his use of all the elements of national power. The Russians call this active measures, adaptive approach, indirect approach. Those are 3 sets of words that you see in the writings depending on who you're reading in their approach, but it is a more broad in all of government. There are those who I think rightfully will so would argue what has changed. Some of this clearly was also going on in the Warsaw Pact days. Let's don't inaccurately report history. But I think the degree to which the Russians have decided to use these tools, and I think the relative freedom that they feel in using them, is the big difference. Okay, that's my teasers on the US, Europe, and Russia. With that last statement, I ask you, in the sense of great power conflict, has anything really changed? Who could offer an opinion? Si, what do you think? Yeah. So I agree with Si. The degree of things that are being done, I think, is the change. We had spying going on. We had disinformation going on. We had economic stuff going on during the Warsaw Pact days. But they were quieter and in the background, and the focus was military. Now we see an inversion of that. So to a degree, nothing has changed. It's just the degree to which things have changed. And that is that these other tools are being used in a much different way. So it talks about the reemergence or the return of great power rivalry in Europe. So is that a correct statement? Maybe not. Maybe we're just in a different phase of an ongoing struggle. The Soviet days, as we said before, were very easy to understand and categorize. And we could almost predict what our opponent was going to do. We got surprised couple of times we got surprised in a big way, but it was a much more stable time. Captain Phil Breedlove in 1983 knew exactly what his job was when I stood in the inter-German boundary of West Germany and East Germany, working for the 2nd Brigade, 3rd Infantry Division in an Army unit. I knew exactly what my job was going to be. I knew who the enemy was. I knew what the enemy looked like, etc., etc. Then we entered into a period after the wall fell of what I will probably inaccurately label along the following lines: a period of Western dominance or multipolar world. Some people argue with me. There are those people who say that during the Warsaw Pact time we had a bipolar world. I'm not an academic and I'm not a historian. I don't think it was bipolar. I think we just didn't recognize what China was. And frankly, I don't think that we recognized what was going on in the Middle East even then between the Shia and the Sunni. And I would have labeled it a multipolar world back then, but I again would probably be corrected by more learned people. So we went from a period of Soviet days to a period of Western dominance, although I would argue it was still a multipolar world. And now we've entered into a time where I believe we truly are in the grandest of definitions in a multipolar world, where we face a revanchist Russia, we face a China that has disciplined approach to its building of national capability, and we face a very tough problem in the Middle East and Russia. So truly a multipolar world with different areas of power. As the tease line here, what has changed about Russia? Who would offer an opinion on that? Yes, sir, in the back.
In theory, it's sort of weaker. It still has a powerful military, but if you compare the GDP of Russia to just the European Union, the Europeans should be able to crush them economically.
Yeah, who could tell me whose economy theirs is about the same size as? Italy, that's what I've heard. It's about the same size as Italy. Okay, so I think that's an easy thing to say. And I've said that and had a very good friend correct me on this, and I'll argue why in just a few minutes. What else? What has changed about Russia?
I'd say it's more open. There's a lot more interaction between their citizens and the world, so it's a little bit more closed off than the Asians.
Wow, I have never heard that. I won't say that's right or wrong. I've never heard that. I got to think that through. I think surely the internet, Western cultures, visitors are changing that dynamic. I'll have to think about whether I would judge it morally.
I guess I wanted to add to my point for a second. The other thing I think that's pressuring them is their demography. They're starting to get the precedence where they're going to have so many more old people than young people. They're building 2 packs. And senators might just not even be there.
Yeah. So I violently agree with you that Russia faces some real structural problems. They're a nation led by kleptocrats. They've got a demographic issue. They are a petroleum-based economy. And their population's ability to meet the future challenges and jobs that would make them profitable is declining as opposed to growing. So there's a lot of demographic and other challenges to Russia, for sure. One more and then we'll move on.
On a technical perspective, it's a lot more possible nowadays for Russia to cover its entire landmass effectively, to cover its borders and national interests, as opposed to in the 50s or the 60s.
Okay, that's an interesting thought. We would have to spend some more time on that. A leading Chinese officer has said not too long ago that he's not worried about his border with Russia because he felt like he could march for 4 to 5 weeks before he encountered the first Russian military person. So I think they're very thin in the East. I think that's a gross exaggeration, but it was an opinion offered by a Chinese military officer. So that's an interesting one. But certainly the interior lines of communication and the electronic lines of communication are far better than they were before. I think I would agree with you there. So what I would add to the end of this is maybe an attitude of their leadership. Mr. Putin saw the fall of Russian leadership in the world, the fall of the Soviet Union. He called it one of the greatest travesties of all time. And he saw his Russia falling from the leadership table of the world. I think that every day since that day, he has been in a personal effort to rectify that situation or to change that situation. And I've heard more than one person in op-eds talk about Russia breaking all the rules. These are not my words, but I have grabbed them as my words because I think they meet the moment. I don't think that Russia is interested in breaking the rules. I think Russia is interested in rewriting the rules. I believe they see that when the wall fell and the Soviet Union fell out of power in the sense of Soviet or Russian power, that they feel like, and remember there's two sides to every story, they feel like they were wronged in the West's way of rewriting what is normal in Europe. And I think now they are interested in rewriting again what is normal in Europe as opposed to breaking the rules that have been established. And I believe, as we talked about in my first discussion, that Russia sees that in a localized sense, they can develop pretty good and, in a local sense, superior military power. But in a prolonged conflict with the West, because of all of these things that you have mentioned, they will be at a disadvantage. And so what does that mean to them? As we spoke about just a few minutes ago, that means that they have brought all the other tools of national power to the table, and they want to accomplish as many objectives as they can at or below a threshold that would engender a more kinetic response from the West. All the tools are back on the table. Some interesting questions we don't have time for today. What is a red line? And where would you draw a red line? Are red lines even useful in today's construct? Have they helped us in our conversation with Russia at all? I think that's a line of questions we should examine. And if you want to examine those in a few minutes, we can. One of the tools that Russia uses is military exercising and demonstrations of capability. Probably the most visible one in the last 6 or so years, but certainly this year and 4 years ago, is the Zapad exercise. Who can tell me what the word Zapad means?
West.
West. It means west. So what is the orientation of this exercise visibly to the world? It is the West, primarily NATO. 2013 was a huge exercise. Now, as a military man, my military men and women, as they looked at 13, there was a lot more show than go. The numbers were huge. A lot of those exercises were done literally outside the gate of local military concerns, and they really didn't have a lot of utility except for counting their numbers in the Zapad exercise. And depending on which historian you listen to or who you read or how classified you report, some say that exercise was as large as 270,000. That's huge. I don't buy that myself personally. The real useful exercising part of that was quite smaller. So as we came to Zapad 2017, which just ended a couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of consternation. And now unclassified, but then classified intercepts pointed to as many as 4,000 rail cars involved in moving the force to the exercise area. Some people still stand by that number. I think it was Maskarovka. I think it was put out there to get the effect it had, which was to really spin up some of the smaller nations of the West. Which bears out which for history will be interesting. The scenario was similar to what Russia had seen in Ukraine. The scenario was a color revolution, bringing to question the Belarusian leadership and the possibility of Belarus being one of the last buffer nations between Russia and NATO. Belarus falling, and Russia having to retake Belarus from the attacking Westerners. The scenario went all the way to decisions made by Mr. Putin about nuclear exchange, nuclear use. All of this unclassified, by the way. So Zapad has a huge meaning for a lot of the folks there. In 2017, we did not see the 4,000 rail cars, but we saw an awful lot. We didn't see this, again, supposed 270,000 troops. We probably saw more like 100,000 troops. But Russia reported only 12,000 of them. Why is 12,000 important? Does anyone know? That's a tough question. Above 12,000 raises the reporting requirements and raises the observer requirements. So they would have had to have been a lot more transparent. So Russia claimed 12,000 people in the exercise. They had leaked that it would be somewhere over 200,000. We believe it was about 100,000 troops. It did involve decisions to use or not use nuclear weapons. It did involve Belarus. If you read the open source papers now, the thing that concerns us the most about Zapad now is that there are a couple of unlocated units. Again, this is all open source. A couple of units that left Russia have yet to return to Russia. And so what does that mean? Where are they? The big fear by Belarus before, because Belarus has been through a period of saying, we don't want more Russian troops in Belarus, we have enough. The fear of Belarus is that a lot of Russians would come there for the exercise and not all of them would go home. This has historical precedent, of course. So Zapad was a big issue, and we will not know for some time now really what happened. By the way, as an aside, how did we get all this information on Zapad that is already releasable? Open source mining of social media and open source mining of newspaper reporting and email traffic, et cetera, has provided almost everything we know about Zapad. And while it's classified, I can just tell you that the classified is tracking very close to what the open sources told us. So it's really interesting what our traditional intelligence sources are becoming in today's day and time. So I've got about 4 or 5 more minutes to talk, and then it's your turn. And if you don't ask me questions, I'm going to start picking faces and asking you questions. Okay, so the last thing to talk about is U.S. forward presence. It is quite an issue of consternation. I would tell you that one of the first things I learned, having led U.S. troops all my life, and then moving into the position where I was in command of NATO troops, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine troops. One of the things that I learned, again, was that there's 2 sides to every story, and it's never as good or as bad as you first hear. So every time that we consider something in our relationship with Russia, We do that from a Western lens. There is also a Russian lens. And there is truth to both sides of the story. The second thing is just like Zapad. We're told it's going to be 270,000, 4,000 plus rail cars. I even reported that because I knew where that fact came from. But what we now know is that was not completely correct. So it's never as good or as bad as you first hear. So I think that when we consider actions like our U.S. forward presence in Europe, we need to keep those two axioms in mind. When Russia looks at a U.S. forward presence, they are very consistent in their messaging to us that we are breaking all the agreements that we made as NATO was formed and in our very first series of NATO summits, whereby the Russians absolutely believe, and there's some truth to the fact that they believe we promised we would not grow NATO. How many were there originally in NATO? Anybody know? 16. How many do we have now? 29. Montenegro. So ostensibly we have grown, have we not? So in a Russian lens, we have broken some of our most fundamental promises. I take umbrage with that argument because I was in NATO as we were trying to add Montenegro and we were trying to add Georgia. I saw the torturous process by which a nation becomes a NATO member. And none of NATO became a NATO member because NATO went out and said, we want you to come be a part of our organization. It happened exactly the opposite. These nations asked NATO, we want to be a partner. And then we throw a torturous program by which they have to go through sometimes 4, 5, 6 years of work, not always, but in some cases 4, 5, 6 years of work to become a part of NATO. So my problem is with the words. NATO didn't grow NATO. NATO grew because nations in their own right to self-determination asked to become a part of NATO. But every time we talk about this, again, we need to realize there's two sides to every story. There is a Russian viewpoint that has some basis in fact, and there is a Western viewpoint. So why do I bring all this up? Is just to say that as Russia sees us returning units to the eastern part of NATO's boundaries, they believe that once again we're breaking promises. This all goes back to an act that brought Russia with observers into NATO and so forth, where we had a conversation about forward presence in the in those former Warsaw Pact countries who are now NATO. And the agreement at the time is that we would not put units in those areas. Units at that time were described as brigade size. Yes, brigade size, 3 battalions. So in the interim, we have begun to introduce units into those countries. Rather than ask more questions to save time, I'll just keep moving. Why do we do that? After the invasion of Crimea and the invasion or supported invasion of Donbass, whichever you think to be true, the nations of Europe, the small ones who used to be in the Soviet Union, became very, very concerned. And at the Warsaw Summit now some 3.5 years ago, or excuse me, at the Wales Summit some 3.5 years ago, NATO chose to begin to put forward these reassurance forces into the easternmost countries of NATO. They started out company size, 150 to 300 men and women going forward. How offensive is 150 to 300 people in a land combat situation? You can't answer. It's not, okay? It's an exercise capability. As Russia went into the Donbass and further worried people, and as they began to build an air-mobile capability about 90 kilometers just east of the Baltic borders, our nations became very worried again. And at the Warsaw Summit, now about a year and a half ago, at the Warsaw Summit, NATO decided to make those units inside these nations battalion sized. So now we essentially have 4 battalion size elements, and one each in 4 nations over there that are forward in Russia. We do that to assure our allies and to begin to form a deterrence basis. 2 sides to every story. Russia sees this as a very offensive in both meanings, offensive to us and offensive capability. And so it has become a point of great consternation. And so I think that at this point we are settled in our future. I believe that you will see continued work on pre-deployment of material, but we have probably come to the end of our deployment of forces in Europe. And I do believe that this will continue to be a source of great concern for the Russians. In fact, they blamed much of what they did in this Zapad exercise on our increase in troop presence in the eastern part of NATO nations, the former Soviet republics. And so that would be the teaser on Zapad. Okay, so you guys have the time hammer. Tell me when to stop. I would like to take anybody's question. I saw that hand in the way back first. Yes?
So what do you see as an area of mutual cooperation that we could build on?
There are so many. And in fact, if you are not familiar with Sam Nunn's NTI, Nuclear Threat Initiative, just inside of Sam Nunn's NTI, he has put together some really good things that we could begin to work on, which would take effect at limiting the dispersal of some of these problems that we see in radiological materials, low-grade radioactive materials, etc., etc. It's talking less about big weapons, but more about precursors and byproducts and other radiological things. But here's the point. I think Russians worry as much about terrorists getting hold of bad weapons because they got their own form of terrorism in their country. I think they worry about it just as much as we do. Secondarily, where are most of the drugs in Afghanistan going? Yeah, not to America. We got our own sources. That stuff's going into Russia. And they have as big, if not worse, per capita drug problem than we do. Certainly not volume that we have in America. But so there's drugs, there's loose radiological materials, there's a whole manner of things where I believe we could start a constructive conversation if we could get past the politics of the time to do that. And I really believe we should do that. Yes, sir, right here.
What is the future of IGOs with the increasing multipolar world?
So define IGO for me. I know 3 different IGOs.
The European Union, because Europe is starting to become a lot more divided, which direction will
So I think that when, if we just talk Russia now, but there's a whole different conversation about China and other places where it's equally as important. But if we just talk Russia, when Mr. Putin looks to his east, he sees a big China that can deal with small nations one-on-one, and quite often Russia will have its way in those, or China will have its way in those conversations. When Russia looks to its east, it sees the EU and NATO. Large, relatively cohesive organizations that he has to deal with in that way, as opposed to saying, I just want to deal only with Spain on this international military issue. Or I just threw Spain out there, it doesn't matter which country you want to talk about. So I do believe that in the West, one of the things that is a strength to us is the organizations that we belong to where we share values. I was at the Wales Summit with our president sitting about from here to where this young lady is from me, around the table. And I listened to then 28 heads of state talk about what was important, because the staffs, we had built them this agenda. And they were looking at that agenda like, what's important to us? And one of the first things they wanted to do was get out a statement of solidarity. And so rather than do anything on the agenda for the first several hours of that summit, national leaders hashed out some agreed to language which said we are completely committed to Article 5 collective defense, and we are completely committed to our shared values, because they're that important. So I think the value, at least in the West, of these IGOs, as you name them, is that we derive strength from the values that we share. Militarily, NATO is about the military. EU is a little bit more about all of government capabilities, but they're both first about our shared values. Yes, sir.
So speaking of those shared values and NATO, let's talk about Turkey for a little while, because that seems to be one of the most vulnerable NATO allies in the entire European or Asian theater right now.
Yeah, I think we'd have to talk about what you mean by vulnerable.
Vulnerable.
I mean, they still have the second largest land army in NATO.
No, vulnerable to leaving NATO.
I got it. That's why I said we'd have to qualify what you mean. So we can't sugarcoat it. We have got issues with the path of some of the leadership of Turkey. We see some retrenchment from the values that we hold dear, beginning to pull at the threads of our alliance. The question I usually get is, what are we going to do about it? I think there is an issue there. It's not the first time that a nation inside of NATO has gotten astray. And it's not, I wasn't there for Warsaw, but I was there in Wales, where I saw 3 or 4 of the large nations of NATO talking to a small Eastern European nation of NATO that was astray at the moment, and had great effect when 3 or 4 of the most powerful people in the world talking to you about, you need to get your act together. Okay? So first and foremost, I think that inside of our alliance, we have to realize that Turkey is an incredibly important, geostrategically important ally. And even more than that, we used to brag about Turkey, and to some degree Egypt, as being the north anchor and the southern anchor in an increasingly violent Islamic problem. And that this was anchors that we could say, look, this works. And so there's a lot of reasons we want to move forward in a positive way with Turkey. And so I think that we have a situation where the leaders of our world are going to have to step up and bring Mr. Erdogan back towards the center of the fold. Quite often we have had NATO nations that have got out there and thought that we'll play both sides of the street and get a better deal from the home team. That has not gone well for them in the past. The home team it wasn't a retribution thing, it's just that they found that the deal they got on the other side of the street went increasingly sour. You don't have to study much about energy history to know the examples I'm talking about. So I'm an optimist. I've served in Turkey many times. I've got a lot of time in Turkey. And I think they are a great nation with incredible people. They've got an increased divide between their urban population and their rural population. Sound familiar? They've got a problem they've got to work through and a political issue of who's reaching out to who to move their agenda forward. And I think that that Turkey will find its path in the future with the West and NATO. And I'm an optimist there, but it's got to be done politically, and I think in almost a personal way. The Macrons, the Merkels, yes, the Trumps and others are going to have to bring their system to bear to help bring Turkey back to the fold. Very complicated. Yes, sir.
What do you think about the current administration's, I guess, posturing and going outside of the diplomatic norms, and just it seems like there's a very different conversation coming out of the White House than what we've seen in the past as far as willingness to take on foreign leaders and things in public and things like that.
Yeah, I'm going to pass on that one. I will answer a question I'd like to answer. And that is that our nation has all kinds of tools. And we need to use them all. We have found ourselves limited in our approach in the past. There's no hiding. You don't have to Google me more than once to find out I have given advice to a president that president didn't take. And that president didn't use a tool that I thought should have been used. That's okay. That's why he's the president and the combatant commander works for him or her. So it worked exactly like it's supposed to work. But the point is, I think that there are all kinds of tools, and we need to use them all. What I would never sign up to by anybody on either side of the fence is compromising our values. Because I do believe it's our values that center us, at least in NATO. That's the question I'd like to answer. Right here.
How do you think that U.S. criticisms of NATO are changing the relationship between the U.S. and Russia, and how do you think it affects Russia?
So I think that the U.S. criticisms of NATO are past history at this point. Do you think they're still going on?
With the current administration, there have been some threats to leave NATO, things like that.
I think those are past tense, right? I think we've had about 3 or 4 very strong proclamations from all levels of our government that we're committed to NATO. So those are past tense. I've already spoken to them in the past. I did on NPR, so I'm in the public as saying some of the words that were used were not constructive in the beginning. There are those that argue with me and say they had the effect. NATO's spending more money on defense now. So I don't know. I try to build bridges. Civil engineer, Georgia Tech, and build bridges. I don't blow up or burn bridges unless, as a fighter pilot, I'm told to. Then I do it really well. In the way back. I'll come to you next.
There was a recent assessment by some academics that after July 2017, Russia has raised their threshold for using nuclear weapons. Do you agree with that assessment or not?
I have not seen that assessment. I haven't seen any writings that change what I saw before, which is, in the words of their foreign minister, nuclear weapons are a logical extension of conventional conflict. We all think that's very wrong. I haven't seen anything since then. I would love for you to show me the reporting you've seen so I could judge what you've read.
Certainly.
Yes, ma'am.
In terms of like returning a great power rivalry, do you think that could be beneficial in any way in terms of promoting economic growth or technological growth, or would it just result in more of us in like?
It does sound that way, doesn't it? But I think the answer is no. I believe there is sufficient impetus to move technology forward right now, because we want to be more. This really sounds bad, but it is just basically the truth. We want to be the most effective, efficient killing machines we can in the military. That doesn't necessarily mean that we want to kill, but we want to be good at it. So I think there is impetus now to get it right. I don't think we need to be bashing heads with Russia in order to stimulate it. I don't think that bashing heads with Russia is helpful in any way, shape, or form. Here's my argument. It's almost completely economic. Russia is a huge market. Russia has one of the best internal networks of roads and railroads in Eastern Europe or Western Russia, depending on how you look at it. Think of the potential of those being added to a market. Those, if you are a student of military historians and thinkers, Jomini writes about interior lines. Russia has the best interior lines in all of Europe, and tying to an economy, tying to a pipeline system like they have, tying to a railroad system like they have, I think could be a great positive for Europe. But Europe needs to want to do that, Russia needs to want to do that, and we are not in any way, shape, or form in an environment or a climate that would be conducive to that now. It's one of the reasons why I say we need to be careful. We need to understand what we're doing. We need to think small at first and develop trust, but we need to start a conversation with Russia, in my opinion.
Okay, so I really hate that I had an interesting conversation here, but you know what? There are other huge groups of people waiting to listen to General Breedlove. So let's give General Breedlove another round of applause.